Welcome to the deep dive. If you're serious about modern PHP development, you definitely know that keeping up with Laravel releases, well, it means dealing with some pretty big architectural changes alongside, all the cool new tools they keep adding.
hmm
So today, we're going to cut through all that noise and really dive deep into Laravel 11.x. Because this isn't just a version bump, right? It feels like a real evolution in how the framework is put together.
Yeah, that's absolutely the core theme we pulled from the sources. It really is an architectural evolution. And our mission for you, the listener, is pretty straightforward. We've gone through a whole stack of docs, upgrade guides, release notes, all dated around January 29, 2025,
Okay.
to give you, hopefully, the fastest and clearest understanding of what's really changed in Laravel 11.
Right. The goal here is efficiency. We want you to get a handle on the new application structure, the whole philosophy behind configuration now, and of course those headline features that are really designed to make your development cycles, well, cleaner and faster. Hopefully much faster.
And the big idea driving Laravel 11 seems to be simplification. That's the word that keeps coming up. It's all about this code-first configuration idea. So less file clutter, streamlined dependencies, and better defaults right out of the box. The idea is you run Laravel new, and you can just start building, not spend the first 20 minutes deleting stuff you don't need.
Okay, let's unpack that simplification thing first, because it really changes how a new project feels right away. You look at the new application skeleton, and it's definitely lighter. And that cleanup seems to stem directly from this code-first configuration model.
Exactly. In older versions, you had all these high-level application behaviors, things like routing, middleware setup, service providers, even exception handling kind of scattered, right?
Yeah.
They were in different config files in the config directory, or maybe managed in their own special classes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with Laravel 11, the bootstrap.php file, it's been totally revitalized. It's designed to be the central hub for these critical decisions.
Right, and that's the massive consolidation we're talking about. This single bootstrap.php file uses this fluent interface, like a chain of methods, to set up the core stuff. You configure routing with routing, you manage your middleware with middleware, and you handle exceptions using with exceptions. It's all just right there
Yeah.
in one place.
It really cuts down on the initial mental load,
Mhm.
take exception handling. That used to need its own dedicated class, usually in app exceptions.
Right, the handler class.
Yeah. Now, you customize how exceptions get reported or rendered directly inside bootstrap.php using a closure.
Mhm.
You get this exceptions object passed in, and you can call methods on it, like it's exception.class if you don't want certain exceptions logged. Or you can define specific reporting logic with something like exceptions report function. Invalid order exception your way. It's much more direct.
Okay, I definitely see the appeal for new projects that's cleaner. But let me push back a little here. Doesn't putting all these crucial things, routing config, middleware, exceptions, into one single Bootstrap file, risk making that file kind of huge and unwieldy in a really large, complex application? Didn't the old way, with smaller, specific config files, offer maybe better separation of concerns down the line?
That's a fair point, especially for big monolithic apps. But I think this shift isn't really about forcing everything literally into that one file. It's more about establishing a single, clear entry point for configuration logic. The core setup happens right where the app boots up.
Okay.
You're still encouraged to define your actual routes in routesweb.php and redsop.php, right? What bootstrap.php does is define how those files are loaded and how the core framework pieces like middleware and exception handling are wired up initially. It actually reduces context switching, I think, because you know exactly where to look if you need to tweak the application's fundamental behavior. It signals maybe a more mature approach from the framework.
And this simplification idea extends to the existing code too, right? I noticed the base controller class seems a lot leaner.
Oh, absolutely. The base controller that ships with new Laravel 11 apps, it doesn't extend Laravel's internal base controller anymore. That's part of trimming down the skeleton application. Your core app logic starts minimal.
So if you need things like, say, the validates requests trait.
You just pull it in explicitly. Use validates requests
Mm-hmm.
to your controller. It forces you to be intentional about what framework functionality you're actually using in your base controllers. Less magic, more explicit declaration.
Okay, let's talk dependencies, the high-impact changes. For folks who've been using PHP and Laravel for a while, this is often where the real significance of an upgrade lies.
Yeah.
That less is more approach to relying on external packages.
Yeah, and the biggest one, technically under the hood, is that Laravel 11 no longer depends on the Dr. Wobble composer package. Dr. DBLL was, well, it was often needed for certain complex schema manipulations, like changing column types in specific ways or renaming columns sometimes. Laravel 11 now handles these kinds of operations internally.
Wow, okay. That is massive. Doctrine DBL often came up as a point of friction, didn't it? Sometimes causing version conflicts during composer updates or needing specific handling.
Precisely. Removing that dependency is a big statement from Laravel about its own capabilities and stability. It should mean fewer external package conflicts down the road and potentially smoother, faster upgrades in the future. It definitely earns that high-impact change label in the upgrade guide. So yeah, if you're upgrading and you still see Dr. Dball in your composer.json, it's probably time to try removing it.
And still on the database side, there's now specific support for MariaDB, showing some love for that ecosystem.
Correct. Previously, you'd typically just use the standard MySQL driver when connecting to a MariaDB database. Laravel 11 introduces a dedicated MariaDB driver, which means you get better, more tailored defaults and potentially more reliable behavior if your application specifically uses MariaDB. It acknowledges that MariaDB isn't exactly the same as MySQL anymore.
Good point. And finally, before we shift gears, just a quick reminder on Laravel's release cycle, especially given how significant these relevant changes are.
Sure, Laravel sticks pretty closely to semantic versioning. So major releases like Laravel 11, which can have breaking changes or significant architectural shifts, those tend to happen about once a year, usually around Q1. But the minor and patch releases, those can come out as often as weekly. And the key thing is, those minor and patch releases should never contain breaking changes. So you should feel pretty confident just running Composer Update regularly to get the latest bug fixes and non-breaking features.
Okay, moving on from the architecture to the big, shiny new features that come with Laravel 11. And the first one is, well, it's potentially a game changer for a lot of teams needing real-time features, Laravel Reverb.
Yeah, Reverb is definitely a headline act here. It's positioned as a blazing fast, highly scalable, real-time WebSocket communication tool built directly by the Laravel team right into the ecosystem.
So the significance is it's a first-party solution.
Exactly. It means developers might not need to immediately reach for external, often commercial, services like Pusher or Ably just to handle basic real-time stuff like notifications or live updates on a dashboard. Reverb provides a self-contained option.
And the integration sounds pretty seamless. It works with Laravel's existing event broadcasting system, right?
Right.
And Laravel Echo on the front end.
That's the promise. You basically configure your broadcasting driver to use Reverb, maybe set a couple of environment variables, and then you just run an artisan command, php artisanreverb.start, to get the WebSocket server up and running.
But is it just like a simple server for development? Or is it built for production scale?
Oh, it's definitely built with production scaling in mind. That's a key part of the announcement. It supports horizontal scaling, so you can run multiple back-end Reverb server processes, perhaps on different machines.
How does it coordinate between them?
It leverages Redis, specifically Redis's publish-subscribe capabilities. When one Reverb server gets a message, it publishes it via Redis, and all the other Reverb servers subscribe to that channel, pick it up, and broadcast it to their connected clients. This allows a single Laravel application to handle a very large number of concurrent WebSocket connections efficiently across multiple servers.
Okay, that sounds powerful. But, self-hosting something complex like a WebSocket server, historically, that comes with trade-offs, right? Compared to just paying for a managed service like Pusher. If Laravel is encouraging this shift towards Reverb, what are the kind of maintenance things or performance aspects developers really need to think about if they choose Reverb?
That's a really important question. Reverb makes the code side super easy, integrating with Laravel's events and Echo. But yes, self-hosting means you are now responsible for keeping that Reverb process running, stable, and scaled.
So things like process management.
Definitely. You'll absolutely need a process manager like Supervisor or Systemed to make sure the php artisan reverb.start command keeps running and automatically restarts if it crashes for some reason. You also need to monitor the health and performance of your Redis server because that becomes the central communication backbone for scaling.
Right.
So the trade-off is, as always, control and potentially lower long-term cost with Reverb versus the sort of zero-ops convenience of a managed service. Reverb definitely swings the balance towards control and efficiency, especially for teams who are already comfortable managing their own infrastructure.
Okay, that makes sense. That brings us nicely to the next major feature area. We're shifting from real-time communication down into the database layer, enhanced database inspection and schema operations. This seems to have a lot of contributions from Hafez Divandori.
Yeah, this is huge for anyone building developer tooling, writing really complex migrations, or just needing to verify their database structure programmatically. Laravel 11 significantly boosts the native schema inspection capabilities.
Hmm.
You can now inspect the database schema directly using the schema facade without having to write raw SQL queries.
What kind of inspection methods are we talking about?
Things that often required external packages or raw SQL before, now you have built-in methods like schema.getAbles, schema.getViews, schema.getColumns, your table name, schema.getIndexes, your data money, and even schema.getForeignKeys, your addable name. Having this level of introspection baked into the core framework is incredibly powerful for things like integration testing or automatically checking if the database state matches the expected migrations.
And it's not just inspection, right? Schema modification gets more flexible too.
Yes. L11 adds native support for modifying, renaming, and dropping columns directly within migrations using Fluent methods. It also improves support for more advanced database column types, like spatial types for geographic data, and handles scenarios where you might be working with non-default schema names within your database connection. It just makes the whole migration system feel more complete and robust.
Okay, now we absolutely have to spend a moment on this critical detail you mentioned from the upgrade guide regarding the change method in migrations. This sounds like a really important defense against accidentally losing schema information.
Yes, this is probably one of the most crucial takeaways for anyone upgrading or working on long-running projects with lots of migrations. When you use this change method to modify an existing column, your migration in Laravel 11 must now explicitly redeclare all the attributes that were previously defined on that column.
So give me an example. If a column was, say, unsigned and nullable and had a default value.
Right. And you just want to change its data type or length using change.
Yeah.
You now must also include unsigned, nullable, default, again in that same change statement.
And if you just change the type and forget to re-add unsigned?
That attribute, the unsigned constraint in this case, will be silently dropped from the column in the database.
Ouch. Why the change?
The rationale seems to be that relying on different database engines to consistently preserve all attributes when modifying a column's type or length was proving unreliable. Different databases behave differently. So Laravel 11 now forces you to be completely explicit in your migration about the entire desired state of the column after the change. It makes migrations more verbose in this case, but also safer and less prone to accidental data truncation or constraint loss. It really forces a careful review of any migration using change.
That's a really good explanation. Defensive coding through explicitness. Okay, one last feature in this section, maybe smaller but potentially high impact, contributed by Tim McDonald. Per second rate limiting.
Yeah, this adds a much finer level of granularity for throttling. Previously, Laravel's rate limiter often worked best with limits defined per minute or per hour. Now you can define limits right down to the second.
Where would that be useful?
Think about preventing microbursts of activity, like someone rapidly clicking an Add to Cart button multiple times a second. Or, maybe more critically, ensuring your application respects very strict per-second API call limits imposed by third-party services you integrate with. It slots right into the existing rate limiter facade, particularly when you use the attempt method to perform an action only if the rate limit hasn't been hit.
Okay, so if the simplified architecture is like the clean new exterior of Laravel 11, then things like the service container and facades, they're really the engine room, right? They handle all the internal coordination needed for building large, solid, and especially testable applications.
That's a great way to put it. The service container is kind of like your application's internal concierge, or maybe it's chief engineer. Its main job is managing dependency injection, meaning it knows how to construct complex objects your application needs. It handles binding interfaces like, say, a payment gateway interface to concrete implementations like a Stripe payment gateway class. And crucially, it automatically resolves dependencies when they're type-hinted in constructors or method parameters.
Why is that so important, especially for listeners looking for the high-impact stuff?
The number one benefit, honestly, is testability. Because the container is responsible for creating these objects, when you're writing tests, you can tell the container, hey, instead of the real Stripe payment gateway, just give me this fake mock version I created.
Right.
This lets you test your own application logic, like your checkout process, in complete isolation without actually hitting Stripe's API or needing a live database connection.
Okay.
Your tests become much faster and more reliable.
Okay. Now, one of the really neat developer experience improvements in L11 seems to be around making dependency injection even easier, specifically with these things called contextual attributes. You mentioned this gets us closer to zero configuration resolution.
Yeah, this is a fantastic addition. Previously, if you needed to inject different implementations of the same interface, based on context, like injecting a different cache driver in one class versus another, you often had to define special rules inside a service provider file. It worked, but it added some boilerplate and meant your configuration logic was separate from where it was used.
Mm-hmm.
Now with L11, you can use PHP 8 attributes, which are basically just metadata tags you put right in your code directly in your constructor properties, or maybe even in route closure parameters. This makes the configuration much clearer because it lives right next to the code that needs it.
Can you give some concrete examples of how these attributes cut down on the code?
Sure. A common one is injecting a specific file system disk. Instead of complex binding logic, you just do this. Hashtag storage local protected file system. The container sees that storage attribute, reads the low argument, and automatically injects the file system instance configured for the local disk, not necessarily the default one.
Yep.
And an even slicker one is the current user attribute. If you have a route closure and that route is protected by the auth middleware, you can just type hint, hashtag current user, and boom, the container automatically resolves and injects the currently authenticated user model for you. It replaces several lines of code you used to write in almost every authenticated route.
Wow, okay. That really does feel like zero configuration. What if the built-in attributes like storage or current user don't cover a specific custom case I have?
You still have full control. You can create your own custom contextual attributes. You just need to create a class that implements a specific contract, the contextual attribute contract. When the container encounters your custom attribute, it will call the resolve method on your attribute class, and you can put whatever logic you need in there to determine what value gets injected. So it's extensible.
Cool. Okay, moving over to facades. This is often a point of confusion, maybe even contention, for developers coming to Laravel. How do facades fit in with the service container we've been talking about?
Yeah, facades can be a bit magical at first. The best way to think about them is as static proxies. They provide this really clean, terse, static-looking way to interact with services like calling cache.key or log.info message. It looks like a static method call.
But it's not really static.
Exactly. It's kind of an illusion. Behind the scenes, that static call is actually being proxied or forwarded to a real object instance that Laravel has resolved out of the service container.
And the aha moment for someone learning this should be understanding why these static-looking calls are still perfectly testable, right?
Precisely. Because the service container is sitting in the middle, managing the real object, you can intercept that proxy call during your tests. You use methods like cache.shouldReceive, get once and return some mock value. Your test tells the facade's underlying proxy mechanism, hey, next time someone calls get, don't actually talk to the cache, just return this fake value instead.
Gotcha. So it maintains that clean syntax but doesn't sacrifice testability. How does this compare to just doing traditional dependency injection, like injecting Cache Manager into the constructor?
Traditional DI, where you explicitly type hint dependencies in the constructor, is often preferred by purists because it's very explicit. Your class clearly declares what it needs. IDs love it for type hinting and refactoring. Facades offer primarily convenience and a very terse syntax, which many Laravel developers find highly readable, especially for common framework services. They achieve this convenience without losing testability, which is the key compromise. It's a stylistic choice, really.
Okay. And we should probably quickly distinguish facades from the simple helper functions Laravel provides, like view, config, app, cache, etc. They feel similar sometimes.
Right. Helper functions offer similar convenience for common tasks, but they typically work differently under the hood. They might directly instantiate something or use a very simple service location mechanism that bypasses the more sophisticated proxy layer that facades use.
And the crucial difference for testing.
Because they don't usually go through that proxy layer, you generally cannot mock standard helper functions using the same should-receive methods you use for facades. Facades are designed with that test mocking capability built in via their proxy mechanism. Helpers are mostly just for convenience in your application code.
All right, so the whole request lifecycle really kicks off with routing, and following that L11 theme of consolidation, routing configuration now lives centrally alongside the app Bootstrap and bootstrap.php, right?
Yep, exactly. You configure your routing setup using that Fluent Maintain routing method. By default, this method handles registering your main route files, typically routesweb.php for web UI routes, routesupply.php for your API, and routesconsole.php for artisan commands. It keeps the high-level definition nice and tidy.
But what about more complex apps? You often need custom route files, maybe for specific things like third-party webhooks or internal admin routes that don't really belong in the main web.php or api.php. Does L11 still allow that flexibility?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's very flexible. Inside the with routing configuration, you can use a then closure. Within that closure, you can manually register any additional route files or groups you need, applying specific middleware, prefixes, or even domain constraints just for those routes.
Okay.
And if you need total absolute control, maybe you want to completely change how Laravel discovers and loads route files. There's also a using closure you can provide to with routing. This lets you bypass Laravel's default HTTP route registration entirely and define exactly how every route file gets included yourself. So full control still there if you need it.
Gotcha. Let's talk rote model binding. That's pretty fundamental to writing clean controller actions in Laravel. Any enhancements there in L11?
The basics are still the same, relying on implicit binding, where Laravel automatically finds, say, a post model based on a post parameter in your route URI. And you can still customize which model attribute is used for the lookup, like using a slug instead of the id, by defining the getRoute keyname method on your Eloquent model. But L11 adds a really nice convenience method directly onto the route definition itself. Missing.
Ah, okay. What does that do?
It lets you define a callback function that gets executed if the implicitly bound model cannot be found in the database.
Hmm.
So instead of just throwing a 404 not found exception.
Which can be a bit abrupt for the user?
Exactly. Instead, you can intercept that failure right in the route definition. Inside the missing closure, you can maybe log the attempt, or more commonly, redirect the user somewhere more helpful, like back to the index page for that resource. For example, return redirect.route post.indexes. It makes handling those not found cases much more graceful.
That's a really nice UX improvement. Okay, moving on to middleware. Again, the theme is centralization. Registration goes into bootstraps.php using neck with middleware.
Yep. Consolidating the definition of global middleware and the middleware groups, like web and API, right there forces a bit more clarity, I think. And when working with middleware, developers always need to remember the execution timing. Middleware runs either before the request hits your controller route closure or after the response has been generated.
And that timing depends on where return next request is placed in the middleware's handle method.
Correct. Any logic you put before calling next request runs on the way in, before the controller action. Any logic after that line runs on the way out, after the controller has done its work and generated a response.
Now, for bigger applications, especially those integrating various third-party packages that might add their own middleware, managing those default groups like web and API can sometimes get tricky. Does L11 offer better ways to tweak those groups?
It does. When you're configuring middleware in bootstrap.php, you get more robust methods for adjusting the default groups. You can use prepend or append methods to add your custom middleware to the beginning or end of an existing group like web without completely redefining it. Or, if you need to, you can use the replace method. This lets you swap out one of the default framework middleware entries, maybe the standard session handler, with your own completely custom implementation while keeping the rest of the group intact. Much finer control.
And middleware priority. That seems critical for making sure things like security checks run in the right order.
Absolutely essential. You need things like session initialization, CSRF protection, maybe cookie encryption to run before things like authorization checks or route model binding. Laravel manages this through a priority list defined within the with middleware configuration. You assign middleware to a priority level. Even if you just tack middleware onto a route seemingly out of order, Laravel ensures it resorts them based on this defined priority before execution. It guarantees critical security layers run first.
We touched on this briefly earlier, but let's clarify terminating middleware, the kind that runs after the response has already been sent to the browser. Why does L11 specifically require these to be registered as singletons in the service container?
Right. It's about the PHP request lifecycle. Once your web server, like Nginx or Apache, has sent the HTTP response headers and body back to the user's browser, the underlying PHP process that handled that request is often finished. It might get shut down or recycled by PHP-FPF to handle the next request.
Okay.
For a terminating middleware's terminate method to actually execute after the response is sent, maybe to do some non-critical background logging or cleanup, the middleware object instance itself needs to still exist in memory. By registering it as a singleton in the service container, Laravel ensures that instance persists throughout the entire application lifecycle, including the shutdown phase after the response is gone. This allows Laravel to reliably call the terminate method right at the very end.
That makes perfect sense. It's managing the object's lifetime to outlast the main request-response cycle. Okay, finally, let's quickly cover the request object itself interacting with the incoming request data.
Sure. The request object is your main window into what the user sent. You've got methods for inspecting the URL path, request path, checking if the path matches a pattern, request as admin, checking if the current route has a specific name, request for admin, or getting the full URL, request full URL.
Yeah.
Pretty standard stuff.
And when checking for input data, developers sometimes trip up on the difference between has and filled.
Yeah, that's a subtle but crucial difference, especially for validation logic. Request has name email, just checks if those keys exist in the incoming data, like POST or query string data. They could be present, but contain an empty string. Request has any name email checks if at least one of those keys is present.
But filled is stricter.
Right. Request filled name checks two things. Is the named key present? And does it contain a value that is not an empty string, 0, false, or null? It's really useful for optional fields that shouldn't be empty if they are submitted. Conversely, request is not filled, name email, checks if all the specified keys are either missing entirely or contain only empty values. Understanding that difference is key for writing robust validation.
Okay, let's face it, a huge part of Laravel's appeal is eloquent and how easy it makes database interaction. So let's dive into data management, starting with something fundamental: safety and consistency using database transactions.
Yeah, database safety really should be top of mind. And Laravel's DB transaction method, or the transaction facade, is definitely the recommended way to handle multiple related database operations that need to succeed or fail together.
And the main benefit is atomicity, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Atomicity. You pass a closure to the transaction method. If any exception gets thrown inside that closure, maybe a query fails, or some validation logic throws an error, Laravel automatically catches it and issues a rollback command to the database. This ensures your database is never left in some inconsistent, half-updated state.
And if everything inside the closure runs without errors.
Then Laravel automatically handles the commit at the end. It massively simplifies the error handling compared to manually starting a transaction, using try-catch blocks, and remembering to call commit or rollback yourself. It's much safer.
Okay. Now, for building queries, especially for reporting or filtering, those date-specific query builder helpers seem really useful.
Oh yeah, they keep your queries really expressive and readable. Instead of having to write raw SQL functions like del12, you can just use fluent methods like blow where a month created L12 or a year created 2024.
Right.
It abstracts away the database-specific syntax and just makes the code cleaner.
We also often run into situations where we only want to apply a query constraint if some condition is met, like if the user actually provided a search term.
Right, and that's where the when method on the query builder is fantastic. You give it a condition, which evaluates to true or false, then a closure to execute if the condition is true, and optionally, a third closure to execute if it's false.
So you can conditionally add where clauses.
Exactly, like when search term function, query when all search term more. It lets you build up complex queries conditionally, without messy if statements cluttering your controller or repository logic. It all stays within the fluent query chain.
Nice. And for scenarios involving high volume data or maybe preventing race conditions when multiple requests might try to create the same record, we should probably talk about upserts.
Yeah, upsert, short for update or insert. Eloquent provides the update or insert method. You give it an array of attributes that uniquely identify a record, like a unique email address, and then another array of attributes that should be set. Laravel will atomically try to find a record matching the unique attributes. If it finds one, it updates it with the second array of values. If it doesn't find one, it inserts a new record combining both arrays.
And there's a closure option there too.
Yes, which is really powerful. You can pass a closure as the third argument to update or insert. That closure receives a Boolean argument, often called exists, which tells you whether the method found an existing record or if it's about to insert a new one. This lets you conditionally define different attributes to set based on whether it's an update or an insert operation. It's super useful for complex logic.
Okay, let's pivot slightly to a really crucial performance topic: pagination. Especially with large data sets, the way you paginate can make a huge difference in query speed and server load.
Oh, absolutely, massive difference. The standard paginate method is what most people start with, and it's great for user experience because it gives you the total number of records. That lets you display those page 3 of 15 links.
But the downside?
The downside is, to get that total count, it has to perform an extra count query, which can be slow on really big tables. And maybe more importantly, traditional pagination relies on the SQL offset clause, limit 10, offset 20. As the offset gets larger, like page 1000, the database has to scan through potentially millions of rows just to discard them before finding the ones you actually want. It becomes really inefficient.
Right. So the first step to optimize that is often simple paginate.
Exactly. Simple paginate is the first optimization. It ditches the expensive total record count query. It only figures out if there are more records available after the current set. So it can only generate next and previous links, not the full page number list. But because it avoids the count and often performs better with offset, it's much lighter and faster, ideal for long, infinite scrolling lists or situations where you don't need the total page count in the UI.
Okay. But for really high performance scenarios, especially on very large, actively changing data sets, the recommendation is often cursor pagination.
Yes, cursor pagination, which you enable using cursor paginate, is generally the most performant method for large datasets. It completely avoids the offset performance trap.
How does it work then?
Instead of tracking the page number or row offset, it tracks the value of the columns you're ordering by for the last item on the previous page. This value is the cursor. The next query then basically says, find the next n items where the ordered column is greater than or less than this cursor value. Because this typically uses an index where clause instead of offset, it's incredibly efficient, especially on indexed columns.
Is there a catch?
The main requirement is that you must have an unambiguous order by clause on your query for cursor pagination to work reliably. It needs a stable order to know where the next items are relative to the cursor.
Gotcha. Okay, shifting to eloquent relationships now. There's this has one of many feature that sounds like it solves a really common and sometimes annoying data retrieval pattern.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant. It simplifies getting, say, the single latest or oldest related record, or maybe the related record with the highest or lowest value in a specific column. Think about wanting to display the most recent login record for each user in a list.
Right, that used to involve subqueries or complex joins or fetching all related records and filtering in PHP.
Exactly. Now you can define a relationship on your user model like latest login, using Hazoni, or maybe most expensive subscription. Eloquent handles generating the efficient query to fetch just that single related record per parent model. It pushes the complexity down to the database layer where it belongs.
Very neat. And in standard many-to-many relationships, we often want to customize the name of that intermediate pivot table attribute for clarity, right?
Yeah, instead of always accessing the pivot table data through model pivot column name, which can be a bit generic, you can give it a more meaningful name. When you define the belongs to any relationship, you just chain on the as subscription method, for example. Then you can access the intermediate table data like user roles, first subscription expire sat. It makes the code much more readable, especially when dealing with multiple pivot tables.
And Eleven also gives us better ways to filter based on data in that intermediate pivot table.
Yep. We now have dedicated methods like where pivot between, where pivot not between, where pivot null, and where pivot not null. These let you easily add constraints based on columns directly in that pivot table when querying the relationship, without always needing to resort to more verbose where-has clauses, especially for common checks like date ranges or status flags on the pivot record itself.
Cool. Okay, let's wrap up this data section with soft deleting and the importance of cleaning up afterwards.
Right. Soft deleting is a fantastic feature for audit trails or allowing users to undo deletions. You add the soft deletes trait, and when you call delete, it just sets a deleted timestamp instead of actually removing the row. You can then query, including trashed items with force delete permanently, force delete, or restore items.
Well, soft deleted rows stick around forever unless you do something right.
Exactly. They could eventually bloat your tables and potentially slow down queries, even if you're usually filtering them out. So Laravel 11 really emphasizes the importance of pruning these soft deleted models. There's an artisan command, model.prune, that you should schedule to run regularly, like daily.
And how does it know what to prune?
You define a prunable method on your eloquent models that use soft deletes. This method returns a query builder instance that specifies which soft deleted records are old enough to be permanently deleted. For example, where delete now. For this pruning process to work reliably with events, the documentation also mentioned that the model should ideally implement the prunable interface and potentially the mass prunable interface for efficiency.
All right, validation. It's like the first line of defense for your application's data integrity. Laravel 11 seems to be making validation rules more readable and maybe more powerful with new ways to define them.
Yeah, the move towards fluent rule builders is a really big win for readability and maintainability. Instead of those sometimes cryptic pipe-separated strings of validation rules.
Like required email max 42555.
Right. You can now define rules using dedicated objects and chained methods. So for a date, it might be rule.date before or equal today. Or for validating a file upload, you could use file.types mp3 wavevine 1KB dash tierway.
What's the advantage?
It's much clearer what the rule is actually doing. And because these are objects, your IDE can provide much better auto-completion and type hinting, catching errors earlier. It just makes defining complex validation logic less error-prone.
Okay, speaking of file validation, there's a really important security distinction the docs highlight between checking file extensions versus checking MIME types, right?
Absolutely critical for security. You should never trust the file extension that the user provides, .jpg, .pdf, etc., because that's trivial for an attacker to fake. Someone could upload a malicious PHP script renamed to image.jpg.
So the extensions rule isn't enough.
It's a first check, maybe. But the much stronger defense is to validate the actual content of the file using rules like MIMEs, which checks against a predefined list of extensions to MIME types, or MIME types, which checks the MIME type directly. The fluent file.types JPG and PN rule is even better because it actually looks at the file's initial bytes to determine its true MIME type, providing a much more robust barrier against malicious uploads. You can also chain on image dimension validation, dimensions.minwidth for image files.
Makes sense. Don't trust user input. What about forms where requirements change dynamically? Like maybe a field is only required if another field has a certain value.
L11 continues to support rules like require if, or required unless, prohibited if, or prohibited unless for these common conditional scenarios. You can provide another field name and its expected value. But for really complex, dynamic business logic that determines if a field is needed, you can also pass a closure, an anonymous function, directly into your validation rules array.
Ah, okay, so the closure can check other request data or maybe session state or even query the database.
Exactly. That closure gets executed during validation, and based on whatever complex logic you put inside it, it can return true or false to determine if the field it's attached to is required or prohibited at that precise moment. Gives you ultimate flexibility.
What about handling more complex input structures, like forms that submit arrays of data, maybe from dynamically add more fields?
Laravel handles nested array input really elegantly, using dot notation for accessing specific nested elements and wildcards for validating all elements within an array.
So if you have an array of photos and you want to validate the profile photo specifically,
You'd use dot notation in your validation rule key, like photos.profile required image.
and if you have an array representing multiple people and you want to validate the email address for every person in that array,
You use an asterisk as a wildcard. Person.email, required email. That tells Laravel to apply the required and email rules to every email field found within the person array, no matter how many people are submitted. It makes validating those dynamic list inputs really straightforward.
cool. And finally, sometimes you need to clean up or modify input data before validation runs, or maybe do some final normalization after it passes. Are there hooks for that?
Yes, form requests, those dedicated validation classes you can create, offer two excellent lifecycle methods for this. First, there's prepare for validation. This method runs before any validation rules are checked. It's the perfect place to sanitize input, maybe trim white space, convert something to uppercase, or even generate a slug from a title field before you validate the slug itself.
Okay, and the second hook.
That's past validation. This method runs only after all validation rules have successfully passed. It's useful for any final data normalization or cleanup before the validated data gets passed on to your controller. Maybe you need to merge some fields, format a date, or move calculated values into their final place in the data array.
Right, preparing the data perfectly before the controller action even sees it. Okay, shifting gears quite a bit now, let's talk about the front-end philosophy in Laravel 11. It seems like Laravel continues to embrace two main approaches.
Yeah, that flexibility is definitely a core part of Laravel's appeal. It doesn't force you into one specific front-end stack. The first path is what you might call PHP-centric. This really leans into using Blade templates, Laravel's templating engine, but supercharging them with Livewire.
Livewire lets you build dynamic, interactive components mostly with PHP.
Exactly. It allows teams who are strong in PHP to build modern reactive UIs without having to build and maintain a completely separate JavaScript single-page application, SPA, and the complex toolchain that often comes with it.
Okay. And the second path.
The second path is more JS-centric. This is for teams who prefer using modern JavaScript frameworks like Vue.js or React. Laravel integrates beautifully with these using a tool called inertia.js.
What does inertia do?
Inertia acts like glue. It lets you build your front end as a classic SPA using Vue or React components, but you still get to use Laravel's familiar server-side routing controllers, authentication, and authorization logic. You make requests from your JS components, Laravel handles them, and sends back JSON data, which Inertia uses to swap out the components on the front end without full-page reloads. It bridges the gap between traditional server-rendered apps and modern SBAs.
And for both of these paths, Laravel offers starter kits to get you going quickly.
Yep. Laravel Breeze is a more minimal scaffolding for authentication, offering starting points for Blade plus Livewire or Vue React with Inertia. Laravel Jetstream is a more feature-rich application starter kit, also providing options for Livewire or Inertia, and including things like team management and profile management out of the box.
And managing all the front-end assets that JavaScript and CSS relies on Vite, right?
Yes, Vite remains the default asset bundler in Laravel 11. It's known for being extremely fast, especially during development. You typically include your compiled assets in your Blade templates using the simple add Vite Blade directive, which handles pointing to the right files in development with hot module replacement or production versioned bundled assets.
And what about security with assets, specifically Content Security Policy, CSP?
That's an important consideration. Modern CSP often requires using a nonce, a unique random token, on any inline script or style tags to prevent cross-site scripting, XSS attacks. Laravel 11 has built-in support for this with Vite. You can configure a middleware that calls vite.uc CSP nonce. This tells Vite to automatically generate a unique nonce for each request and add it to the script style tags generated by the add Vite directive. Your CSV header just needs to include that nonce value. It makes implementing a secure CSP much easier.
Okay, we're heading into the home stretch, looking at some of the utilities, queue management features, and command line enhancements in Laravel 11 that are really designed for workflow efficiency and robustness. Let's start with the powerhouse, the Artisan console.
Artisan is definitely still the heart of many development and deployment workflows. One really practical feature for managing long-running or sensitive tasks is isolatable commands.
What does that do?
If you have an Artisan command, say, one that processes large files or rebuilds a search index, you might only want one instance of that command running at any given time across your whole application, even if multiple servers try to trigger it via a scheduler. By adding the isolated flag when defining the command schedule, or by having the command implement the should-be isolated interface, Laravel will automatically use your application's cache driver, like Redis or Memcache, to acquire an atomic lock before the command runs. If the lock can't be acquired because another instance is already running, the command simply won't start.
Ah, okay. That prevents concurrent runs of tasks that shouldn't overlap. What about triggering commands from your web application code, like from a controller or a route?
Yeah, that's common too. You use the Artisan facade for that. If you need to run a command synchronously and maybe get its output right away, you use artisan.call, your .command option value. But more often, especially for longer tasks, you'll want to dispatch the command to the queue to be processed asynchronously in the background. For that, you use artisan.queue, your .command.
Right, keeps the web request fast. Okay, let's dive into job middleware. This seems like a really elegant way to add cross-cutting concerns to your queued jobs. We could maybe group these by the kind of problem they solve. How about security first?
For security, the key one is the shouldbeen encrypted interface or attribute. If your job class implements this interface or uses the attribute, Laravel will automatically encrypt the entire serialized job object before it gets placed onto the queue backend, like Redis, SQS, or your database.
Why is that important?
Because the job object might contain sensitive data, maybe user details, API keys, financial information. Without encryption, that data would be sitting in plain text in your queue store, potentially accessible if that store was compromised. Should be encrypted ensures the data is protected while it's waiting in the queue and is only decrypted by the worker process just before execution.
Okay, good practice. Next problem. Concurrency control for jobs dealing with the same resource.
Right. That's solved by the without overlapping job middleware. This is incredibly useful. You attach this middleware to your job class and provide a key, often based on the job's data, like a user ID or an order ID, new, without overlapping. Laravel will then ensure that only one job with the same key can be processed at any given time. If a second job for the same order ID is dispatched while the first is still running, the second job will be temporarily released back onto the queue to try again later, preventing race conditions or conflicts when multiple jobs might try to modify the same data concurrently.
Very smart. And the final challenge. Dealing with jobs that fail repeatedly, maybe due to external factors like a third-party API being temporarily down or rate limiting you.
Yeah, that's where throttles exceptions comes in. This middleware is perfect for handling situations like hitting API rate limits. You configure it typically in your job's middleware method. You can tell it to throttle retries, but only if the job fails with specific types of exceptions, like maybe an HTTP client exception with a 429 status code.
Mm.
You can set a limit, like allow 10 attempts per minute. If the job fails with that specific exception more often than allowed, Laravel will hold back subsequent retries for a while, preventing your workers from constantly hammering an external service that's temporarily unavailable or overloaded.
That prevents runaway job failures from overwhelming external systems or your own queue. Okay, moving on from individual job middleware to managing workflows, job chaining and batching.
Right. These are for coordinating multiple jobs. Job chaining, using bus.chain.dispatch, is all about ensuring sequential execution. You provide an array of jobs or closures. The second job in the chain will only be dispatched if the first job completes successfully, the third only runs if the second succeeds, and so on. If any job in the chain fails, the rest of the chain is canceled. It guarantees a specific order of operations.
Okay, so chaining is for sequence. What about parallelism?
That's where job batching comes in, using bus.batch. Batching lets you dispatch a whole group of jobs that can potentially run in parallel across multiple queue workers. The power of batching comes from its lifecycle callbacks. You can define then closures that run only if all jobs in the batch succeed, catch closures that run if any job fails, and finally, closures that run regardless of success or failure once all jobs have finished.
That sounds great for processing large data sets or kicking off many related tasks. Is there anything individual jobs within a batch need to be aware of?
Yes, a crucial robustness check. Since batches can be canceled externally, maybe by an administrator through a UI, it's good practice for every job running inside a batch to check if the batch has been canceled before doing significant work. You do this by calling if-get-turn. This prevents workers from wasting time and resources processing items from a batch that's already marked as canceled. And don't forget to schedule the queue.prune batches command daily to clean up old batch metadata from your database.
Good tip. Okay, let's wrap up with 3 really handy helper functions highlighted in L11 that impact performance and code style. First up, once.
Once is a neat little performance optimization helper. You wrap a closure, a piece of code, with once. Laravel guarantees that this closure will be executed only one time during a single application request lifecycle. Any subsequent calls to once, with the same underlying object context during that same request, will simply return the cached result from the first execution.
Where would you use that?
It's great for expensive calculations or initializations that might inadvertently get called multiple times within a single request. For example, maybe calculating complex user permissions, or initializing a heavy third-party service object. Once ensures that expensive work happens just once per request, saving resources.
Okay. Next, there's a helper mentioned as being in beta, defer. What's the goal there?
Defer looks really interesting to optimizing web response times. It allows you to schedule a closure to be executed after the main HTTP response has already been successfully sent back to the user's browser.
Ah, so offloading non-critical tasks.
Exactly. Think about things that don't need to happen before the user sees the page. Maybe sending some non-essential analytics data, clearing a specific cache tag, performing some light background logging. By deferring these tasks until after the response is sent, you ensure they don't add any latency to the user's perceived page load time. To make this work, you do need to add the invoke deferred callbacks middleware to your relevant middleware group, like web.
Very cool for shaving off milliseconds. And finally, the functional helper tap. What does that do?
Cap is more of a code style and fluidity helper. It takes a value, like an object or a variable, and a closure. It executes the closure, passing the value into it. Inside the closure, you can do whatever you want with that value, like modify properties on an object, call methods on it, maybe log it. But the key thing is tap always returns the original value that was passed into it, regardless of what the closure itself might return.
How is that useful?
It avoids temporary variables in common scenarios where you want to perform an action on an object and then immediately return that same object. For instance, instead of user.find01, user update, return user to fee, you could write return tap user.findOname. It chains the action and the return together cleanly. It just makes certain patterns a bit more concise and expressive. Hashtag outro.
Wow, okay. That was definitely a deep dive into the architectural evolution that is Laravel 11. If we try to synthesize the main themes, I think the biggest one has to be that massive commitment to simplification, especially unifying all that core configuration into the bootstrap.php file. It really feels like it cuts down on boilerplate and just, the initial mental overhead.
I agree. That consolidation and the streamlining efforts like removing major dependencies like Doctrine DBAL, it really signals a framework that's maturing becoming more self-reliant and efficient. And this architectural confidence seems paired with adding these really powerful, often self-contained features like reverb for WebSockets and these elegant developer experience wins like contextual attributes for DI or the defer helper for performance. It all feels geared towards making modern web development faster, cleaner, and more secure.
Yeah, that evolution from having configs scattered everywhere to this more code-first control, combined with tools that directly address real-world development pain points like concurrent job safety without overlapping, or building database schema confidence with the new inspection tools and the stricter change method, it makes Laravel 11 feel like a really exciting and genuinely impactful release.
Absolutely. So for you, the listener, wrapping this all up, here's our final provocative thought to mull over. We've seen just how easy Laravel is making things like real-time communication with Reverb and handling background tasks efficiently with queues, job middleware, and now this defer helper. Given this strong push towards code-first configuration and built-in solutions, what's one administrative task, maybe something manual or high latency, in your current workflow? Perhaps clearing out temporary files, generating a daily summary report, cleaning up old log entries. Could that task be instantly and elegantly replaced by a simple automated artisan command scheduled to run regularly? Or maybe even offloaded completely from the user request cycle using a deferred function. Maybe take a fresh look at the artisan command documentation and the possibilities with defer, and see if you can bring some of that relevant efficiency into your own projects.
Great thought. Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.